So, as the Battle of Locato on the 26th of August 1914 draws to a close, the 2nd Battalion, Essex Regiment, as part of the 12th Brigade, along with the rest of the 4th Division, and in fact the rest of the British Army, starts to pull back to the south, breaking contact with the German Army. This journey was to become known in the British Army and more widely as the retreat from Mons, and was to see the battalion covering hundreds of miles over a number of days. This isn't the time and the place to go into a list of all the villages that the battalion passed through, and we don't have time or place, or I don't have the knowledge to cover all of the stories and experiences of the battalion at this time. So we'll have a look at a few episodes which will hopefully illustrate what was going on. We'll return to our earlier correspondent, Lieutenant Noel Irwin, and he writes in his book Infantry Officer, "For me and two other active officers, active operations very nearly came to an end on the night after the Battle of Locato. Tired, we had found a barn full of straw onto the top of which we had climbed to sleep, the sleep of the just. At 3 o'clock in the morning of the 27th, the battalion resumed its march, leaving us in arms of Morpheus, unconscious of its departure. Only the timely arrival of a search party, which returned to look for us, saved us from falling into the hands of the Germans, who entered the village a few moments later." And I highlight this account to show the exhaustion that the men may have been feeling after their first action. It also shows us the somewhat unstructured nature of things, because the 4th Division had been thrown into the battle. They weren't as structured as they could be. Their logistical support wasn't necessarily in the right places, and the expectation had not been to arrive and within 24 hours be retreating. Irwin gives us some further information about some other parts of the retreat. Speaking of the next day, he says, "One of the most distressing sights for us during the retreat was the burning of our baggage. Extra transport for the carriage of sick and wounded was required, and some high authority ordered regimental baggage wagons to be unloaded, the kits to be burned, and the vehicles to be used for troop carrying. It was on the second day after Locato that the battalion in its withdrawal passed a pyre of burning kits and valises which, on inspection, proved our horror to be our own, our only possessions. Other than what we stood up in or had in our haversacks on their backs in those days, officers carried only a rolled waterproof, not packs like we did later, so our remaining wardrobe was very bare. This destruction was particularly unfortunate for me, because I had bought a new pair of marching boots before leaving England, and, wishing to give them a run-in before real active operations started, I had worn them on the journey forward from the port, intending to change into a well-worn pair after detrainment. These hopes and intentions vanished in flames and smoke, with the result that before long I was exceedingly footsore." And this is probably an experience of many of the soldiers as they retreated from Mons. The British Army was a professional army at the time, but many of the soldiers that had been that were in position in the 4th Division, 2nd Battalion, Essex Regiment, were actually reservists. So soldiers joining the army at the time would join and serve a period with the colours. For many of them it would be 7 years, and then they'd be discharged back to civilian street, but they would still have a reserve obligation, and typically it'd be 5 years to make a total of 12 years service. So many of the men that were fighting here had been called back to the colours and had been civilians perhaps only a month or so beforehand. And so this retreat was probably very arduous. It was August, it was France, it was hot, there was rain, the logistics had broken down a bit, as we've said before, so it was a great physical ordeal, the retreat. Now, as the battalion retreated to the south, and to be honest, this is as the retreat starts to come to an end, they found themselves in a town which I will mispronounce as Ferrez. On marching into Ferrez Park, a very muddy and dirty private soldier in French uniform came up to Colonel Anderley and told him dinner would be ready for the Essex officers at the chateau. This man was Baron Rothschild, and the chateau is still there, as you can see from this image, though now it is a hotel and trendy restaurant associated with La Valley shopping location, and which itself is kind of associated with Disneyland Paris. So quite a lot of change there. But this was not quite the high or sort of the final mark of the retreat from Mons, but the momentum was starting to come out of it. And there was lots of efforts to try and make sure that battalions stayed as part of brigades, brigades part of divisions, that divisions knew who was beside them and so on. And so it was quite common for small parties to be sent out on reconnaissance. And the night after staying in the Chateau de Ferris, Lieutenant Binstead is listed in the regimental history as taking a 4-man detachment out on one of these patrols. And we'll just pause to consider Gerald Charles Binstead for a moment. He's quite an interesting character. He was the son of a soldier himself. He was born in Cairo in 1885, educated at Wellington College, and then went on to Sandhurst, gazetting to the Essex Regiment in 1905. He was awarded the Sword of Honour, which is kind of like best student, if you like, during his time at Sandhurst. And at Wellington, he'd represented the school at Bisley for shooting and had been winner of the mile race. Something he'd kind of continued with, winning a half-mile race amongst the subalterns in Malta and the officers' mile race in the All-Ireland Military Athletic Meeting. Captain Binstead was also a very good linguist and had passed qualifications as an interpreter in French, Russian and Chinese. And he was, at one point prior to the war, seconded to the War Office for special employment. And I've not been able to find out anything more about what that was. But he was returned to the battalion and came overseas with them at the beginning of the war. He'd also travelled widely before the war, and he contributed to articles about Mongolia and about China, and was published in articles or journals, as we can see here. He was a member of the Geographic Society, the China Society, Asiatic Society, and he was a contributor to the China yearbook, the Far Eastern Review, and so on. So as the retreat starts to slow, its momentum starts to change, the battalion finds itself in the interesting place of starting to cover or return to the north, passing through territory it had covered before. And we return to Lieutenant Noel Irwin and his account of this period in time. We had an exciting evening and night during the advance to the Aisne. As dusk was closing in, we were advancing along a road which sloped gently down ahead of us and had disappeared from view around a wood. About 300 yards away we saw a body of cavalry leisurely approaching. We must have closed to within 100 yards or less in the half-light before recognising each other as foes. The Uhlans, for such they were, turned around and galloped off, while the leading men of my company, standing or kneeling, opened fire into the galloping mass. We must both have been equally surprised, we, because we had relied on our cavalry being ahead of us, the Germans, because their leisurely, unprotected movement clearly showed they cannot have expected to meet British infantry on that road. And both the regimental history says that the Uhlans, these German soldiers, these German cavalry soldiers, left a couple of lances on the ground and also a helmet pierced with some bullets. Irwin continues, that evening I was sent for and told to take a patrol and find out where the Germans were. I selected 3 men from my patrol and, fully armed and recruited but without our packs, we set off after dark for a village about 3 miles away called Perelevy. The night was fairly light and we had gone barely half a mile when we were frightened out of our lives by the sudden whinnying of a horse in a wood we were skirting. We froze in our tracks. We thought we must be near the Uhlan bivouac. But hearing no more, we pressed on towards the village very slowly, very cautiously, and very silently, until we reached its outskirts about 2 hours later. Here we found ourselves on a campsite, obviously only recently occupied, and from its smouldering fires collected for examination later, a number of letters and papers we saw lying about. We then climbed over the village walls, through gardens, into the main street. The village was deadly quiet and seemed deserted, but we could not be sure, and in any case did not want to stir up a hornet's nest by entering carelessly. While peering up and down the main street, we spotted an isolated light some distance beyond the village and made towards it with extreme care and some anxiety. It came from a sizable farm towards which we moved in patrol formation, one man about 10 yards or so ahead of me, the remaining two following a similar distance behind. It got to within perhaps 100 yards of the farm when we were stilled in our tracks by the challenge of a German sentry, "Hot wieder?" followed, much too quickly, by a shot. We dropped to the ground and remained motionless for a moment or two until we heard a lot of excited movement in the farm as troops rushed to their alarm posts. This was too much for us, and deciding discretion to be the better part, we beat it. I remember the undignified retreat with some disgust and discredit. My leading man was the first to consider it time to put a greater distance between us and the enemy, and, without further ado, rose up and ran back to join his comrades who, infected by the anxiety of the moment, joined in the hurried and noisy withdrawal. I remember the leading man saying as he ran past me, "Come on, sir," which I admit, on finding myself momentarily alone, I did not hesitate to do. I excused myself later by saying that we were a reconnaissance patrol, and it was our duty to get information and get it back to our commanders quickly. We made no mistake about fulfilling this latter duty. We did it at a moderate speed. It took about 2.5 hours to do the outward journey of 3 miles, but we returned in well under the hour. This hasty retreat taught us our first lesson: travel light on patrol. The noise made by our hurried withdrawal would, we felt, have woken the dead. Fully recruited, our bayonets and entrenching tools and haversacks clattered and clanged like an agitated ironmongery stand. But we were much too concerned to stop until we put 1,000 yards between us and the enemy, who must, had we paused to think, have been as alarmed as we were ourselves. Next day, on re-entering the village, so this is them moving to the north, we were told by some inhabitants, as remained, that the Germans had left it only early that morning, and that the farm from which we had so hastily withdrawn had been occupied by a squadron of cavalry, who had also departed before daylight. So perhaps 4 frightened infantrymen might claim, even if only indirectly, to have put a squadron of Uhlans to flight, no less than they themselves had been put to flight. So the battalion, as part of this division, is now starting to move to the north, more precisely towards the northeast, and is advancing towards the aim. And the next kind of landmark bit that we're going to pick up on is the crossing of the Marne. Now, the picture in the middle is from the Regimental History by Burroughs, and the one on the right from Google Earth and the one on the left from Google Maps, to show like more modern day comparisons. And we can see the village of Chamonix, which I'm sure I've mispronounced. We can see that bend, distinctive bend in the river, which is both on the older maps there and is still existent on the ground. And turning to the regimental history for our information that we get here. Lieutenant Colonel Anley received orders at Tartaral to choose a point on the right to cross the river, the Lancashire Fusiliers and Essex being placed under his command. He decided to make the attempt at the lock at Chamonix, lying to the west of Lunsey. D Company acted as an advance guard and moved through the woods to within half a mile of the barrage. And if you look at that image on the right-hand side, we can see that there's a hilled area and there's woods in the kind of right-hand side of the image to the eastern side of the image, because both maps and that image are orientated to the north. D Company acted as an advance guard and moved through the woods to within a half mile of the barrage. Here the men were halted whilst the company commander, Major Moffat, and Lieutenant Binstead went forward to reconnoitre, being joined shortly afterwards by the brigade machine gun officer, Captain Hallahan. They decided upon the most concealed line of approach and a place for the machine guns a little to the right. The company was guided to the edge of the woods within 400 yards of the objective. In front was the roadway, then the water meadows and causeway leading to the lockkeeper's house. The Marne lay beyond. On the far bank, in the picturesque sylvan setting of autumn, was Chamonix, though the beauty of the situation was little in mind of the observers. Were the enemy holding the village in force, and were they still withdrawing? That was the preoccupation. A white spaniel created some apprehension of discovery by the watchful enemy because it would insist upon running about looking for rabbits while Major Moffat was pointing out the situation of the barrage to Lieutenant Colonel Anley. It was agreed that if the position was occupied, the enemy were in a small copse on the bank opposite the lock gates. This surmise proved correct, for later over a dozen Germans were observed hurrying along the open ground to the rear, while a continuous stream of horsemen and wagons were seen retiring along the tree-lined roadway, clearly outlined on the skyline beyond Chamonix. Accordingly, Sergeant Sharpley, with 8 men, was instructed to make a dash from the woods, cross the river, and under cover of some dead ground to reach the canal bank. And I'll just pause from the regimental history there for a moment. Sergeant Sharpley is someone that's going to reappear a number of times in our story, and he seems to be one of these people that in a time of a crisis, when it's needed, would step forward or put his hand up. Writers more linked to the Second World War, Lionel Rigram and perhaps even Sidney Jarrett, have put that or expressed the view that in any group of soldiers, whether it's a platoon or a company, that there's going to be different groups of people. There'll be a group, and it's typically a very small group, perhaps 2 or 3, maybe 4 in a platoon, which would be 30, 40 men perhaps. But this small group, that'll be the ones that will kind of get up and do stuff. There's then quite a significant large group that will then follow those people when they set an example. There's and doing their best to kind of take part. There's then another group who will kind of do what they absolutely have to, but will not necessarily seek out kind of having to do anything that's dangerous. And then there can also be a group who will actively avoid taking part in any action, and this is the groups that may not even fire their weapons and so on. And I'd suggest that Sergeant Sharpley is clearly in this first group, the ones that will get up, that will take action, as we will see as the story develops, not just in this episode, but in later episodes. So Sergeant Sharpley and 8 men are moving forward to try and get to the lockkeeper's cottage. And we can see that in the picture here, because it's described as a 2-story building. So in the drawing image here from the regimental history, it's the right hand of the buildings. But if we look at Google Maps or Google Earth now for a modern view, we can see that things don't seem to have changed too much. And if we zoom in a bit closer, we can see there's still 2 buildings there, though the lock itself has changed. And at the right hand of those 2 buildings still seems to be a 2-story. Whether it is or is not the same building, I generally do not know. So Sharpley is told to take 8 men and move towards the lock, make a dash across the road. And as they come down the slope, which we've viewed in these previous pictures, they come into fire from the opposite side of the canal. The machine guns that have been put in place to cover them instantly reply, and under cover of this fire, Sharpley and his men reach the canal, though 2 men are wounded. One of his men, Private Gray, actually comes back over this ground under fire to bring a message that he's found a covered route that can take them in, and a Lieutenant Vance is assigned with 2 platoons to go back with Private Gray, following a covered route so that they can get to the lock. Now, Lieutenant Vance was born in Bexley Heath in 1886. He was educated at Dover College and then went on to Sandhurst, playing a sportsman, particularly with a bit of cricket when he was in college, university, but hockey and football within the battalion. Sergeant Sharpley, funnily enough, has also got a football link in that he had played for Leicester City Football Club, only on one occasion, but I don't know how much time he spent in and around the squad. But once they managed to get themselves to the lockkeeper's cottage, they find only the lockkeeper and his wife in position. They build up a firing line along the canal bank, and Major Moffat brings forward more men and actually leads the way, crossing the lock, revolver in hand, using a small footbridge, and now the 2nd Essex are on the north side of the river. As they push away from the river, the Germans are disappearing in front of them. And as night falls on this day, which is the 9th of September 1914, the battalion finds itself just to the northeast kind of corner of Chamonix, at a junction which isn't very well seen here on this map. It's kind of hidden by some of the trees, digging themselves in to protect the gains of today. And they're now in a position where they can start advancing and are going to head towards the aim.